The farmer's kitchen was an art gallery of disaster, and Xavier Brennan loved every crooked line. 17 sheets of parchment hung on his walls in mismatched frames he had cobbled together from old barn wood and wire, each one displaying poetry so magnificently terrible that he sometimes read them aloud to his chickens just to hear the words in the world. The latest had appeared 3 days ago, tucked into the split rail of his eastern fence where the property line met the road to the blacksmith's forge, and he had given it pride of place above the butter crock where he could see it while he ate his breakfast. Your beard is like the hedgehog brown, it prickles when you wear your frown, but when you smile the sun comes round and makes the turnips in the ground. The rhyme scheme collapsed halfway through. The meter lurched like a 3-legged mule. Xavier adored it with the kind of helpless affection usually reserved for ugly dogs and lopsided cakes. Someone, somewhere in the farming valley of Millbrook, watched him work his fields and thought about hedgehogs and turnips, and that person had feelings so large and clumsy they spilled out in anonymous verse. He had no idea who wrote them. The first had appeared in early spring, back when the plowing had just begun and the morning frost still clung to the furrows. He had assumed it was a prank, some village child's joke, until the second arrived a week later with equally earnest awfulness. Then a third, then a fourth. They came irregularly, sometimes 2 in a week, sometimes none for a fortnight, but they always appeared in the same place, always on cheap parchment, always unsigned. Xavier was 32 years old, broad-shouldered from a decade of farm work, with a brown beard that did, in fact, bristle when he frowned. He had inherited the farm from his father 5 years back and had been too busy coaxing a living from the rocky soil to think much about romance. The village girls treated him kindly enough, but there was never a spark, never a poem tucked into his fence comparing his beard to hedgehogs. He was, without quite meaning to be, charmed. The morning was bright and cool, the kind of day that made the wheat shimmer gold in the fields. Xavier finished his porridge, pulled on his work boots, and headed out to check the fence line. It was becoming a habit, this daily inspection of the eastern posts, though he told himself it was just good farming sense to keep an eye on the boundaries. The blacksmith's forge sat a quarter-mile down the road, close enough that he could hear the ring of hammer on anvil when the wind blew right. Wren Aldrich ran the forge and ran it well. She was an orc woman, green-skinned and tusked, with the kind of quiet competence that made people forget to be afraid. She had arrived in Millbrook 3 years ago with her papers in order and her tools on her back, and she had set up shop in the old forge that had sat empty since the previous smith drank himself to death. The village had been wary at first. Orcs were rare this far into human territory, and the stories from the border wars still lingered in memory, but good metalwork spoke louder than prejudice. When your plow blade needed mending or your horse needed shoeing, you went to Wren, and you paid fair price, and you didn't ask questions about tusks. Xavier had his own suspicions about the poems, but they seemed too unlikely to credit. Wren was reserved to the point of silence, speaking only when spoken to, conducting her business with brisk efficiency. She was strong, as orcs were, but built lean and graceful, not hulking. Her hair was black and kept in a practical braid. Her eyes were the color of river stones. She had never, in 3 years, said more than 10 words to him at a stretch. Still, the forge was a quarter-mile down the road, and the poems appeared on the fence between his farm and that road. And sometimes when he brought his tools in for repair, she would look at him a moment too long before turning back to her anvil. He checked the fence. No new poem. He was surprised by the depth of his disappointment. That evening, on impulse, He sat down at his kitchen table with a sheet of good paper and wrote a reply. His handwriting was better than the mystery poet's, his rhymes cleaner, but he kept the tone light and playful. I found your verse beside the wheat, and thought the words were very sweet. My beard may prickle. This is true, but hedgehogs still have feelings too. He added a small sketch of a hedgehog wearing a farmer's hat, because he had always been decent with a pencil, and because he wanted to make the poet smile. Then he walked out in the twilight and pinned it to the same fence post where the poems appeared, weighing it down with a smooth stone so the wind would not carry it away. The next morning it was gone, and in its place was a new poem. You drew a hedgehog with a hat. I did not know you could draw. That my words are clumsy. This I know, but still they come. They grow and grow. Xavier laughed out loud, startling a crow from the fence. The mystery poet had a sense of humor about her own terrible rhymes. He was certain now it was a her, though he could not have said why, and she was reading his replies. This was no longer a strange, one-sided correspondence. This was a conversation. He wrote back that same evening. Your words may stumble, trip, and fall, but I have framed them on my wall. Each crooked line and mangled rhyme is worth more than a poet's time. It was true. He was running out of wall space. The paper courtship bloomed like wildflowers through the summer. The mystery poet wrote about his fields, his horses, the way he sang to himself while he worked. She wrote about the shape of clouds and the color of the evening sky and the way the wheat bowed down before the wind like a golden sea. None of it rhymed properly. All of it was hopelessly sincere. Xavier replied with wit and warmth, sketching little illustrations in the margins: a horse, a wheat stalk, a crescent moon. He began to look forward to the fence post visits the way other men looked forward to market day or harvest festival. He still did not know who she was, but he thought about her constantly. He imagined her writing by candlelight, frowning over the parchment, trying to force words into shapes they did not want to take. He imagined her tucking the finished poems into her pocket and walking to his fence in the early morning or late evening when no one would see. He imagined her reading his replies with a smile she would never show the world. He was falling in love with a person he had never met, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. In late summer, he brought a broken hoe blade to the forge for repair. Wren took it from him with her usual quiet efficiency, examining the crack in the metal with a critical eye. 2 days, she said. Her voice was low and clear, with the slight guttural undertone common to orcs. No hurry, Xavier said. He lingered by the forge, watching her work. She had rolled up her sleeves against the heat, and her forearms were corded with lean muscle. Her hands were scarred from years of metalwork, but they moved with precision and grace. She glanced up, caught him watching, and something flickered across her face too quickly to read. Is there something else? She asked. No, Xavier said. Then, because he could not help himself. Do you read much poetry? Her whole body went still. For a moment she just stared at him, her river stone eyes wide, and he saw a flash of something that might have been panic. No, she said. I do not. Pity, Xavier said lightly. I have been reading quite a lot lately. Terrible stuff, mostly. I love it. Wren turned back to the forge so quickly she nearly knocked over a bucket of water. 2 days, she repeated, and her voice was strained. Xavier left the forge grinning. He was almost certain now. That evening there was no poem on the fence, and none the next day either. Xavier felt the absence like a missing tooth, something his mind kept probing anxiously. Had he frightened her off? Had his question at the forge been too direct, too knowing? He checked the fence post morning and evening, but the space remained empty. On the 3rd day, he wrote a poem of his own and pinned it to the post. The fence has been quiet. The post stands bare. I miss the words that used to wait there if I have caused offense. I apologize, your poetry is the best of any prize. He meant every word. He did not care if the rhymes were clumsy or the meter was broken. He cared that someone saw him, truly saw him, and tried to capture that seeing in words. The next morning the poem was still there, untouched. His heart sank. But when he walked back toward the house, he saw a figure standing by his front door, and his breath caught in his throat. Wren stood on his porch, still as a statue, holding a rolled sheaf of parchment in both hands. She was wearing her leather work apron over a simple green dress, and her black braid hung over one shoulder. She looked terrified. "I wrote them," she said as he approached. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the parchment. "I wrote all of them. I know they are terrible. You do not have to pretend." Xavier stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, afraid that if he moved too quickly she would bolt. "I was not pretending," he said. "I love them. I framed every single one." "I know," Wren said. "I saw them. Through the window last week when you were in the fields. I should not have looked, but she stopped, struggling with the words. "In my clan, poetry is courtship. It is how we declare intent." "I did not think you would understand that. I did not think you would keep them." "I kept them because they matter to me," Xavier said. "Because you matter to me." Wren shook her head sharply. "You do not know me." "I know you see hedgehogs in my beard and moons in my plow," Xavier said. "I know you think about turnips and sunshine. I know you are brave enough to leave your heart on my fence post in terrible rhymes. That is more than most people know about anyone." For a long moment, Wren said nothing. Then she descended the porch steps and held out the sheaf of parchment. "I brought you these," she said. "The rest of them. The ones I did not have the courage to leave." Xavier took them carefully, as though they were made of spun glass. There were at least a dozen sheets, covered in the same awkward handwriting he had come to know so well. "May I read them?" "If you want to," Wren said. She looked away toward the fields. "They are no better than the others." Xavier unrolled the first sheet. "The farmer does not know I watch when he sings to the morning sky. His voice is not beautiful or fine, but it makes me want to cry. The rhyme was broken." The meter was a disaster. Xavier felt his throat tighten with emotion. "These are beautiful," he said quietly. "They are terrible," Wren corrected, but there was a small, hesitant smile at the corner of her mouth. "Then I will frame them with the others," Xavier said. "I am running out of wall space. I may have to start on the bedroom." The smile grew. "You are serious, completely." Wren looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the fear and hope tangled together in her eyes. "My people will not approve," she said. "Humans and orcs do not mix. And even if they did, poetry courtship is a serious vow. If I continue to write for you, I am declaring my intention to bind my life to yours. There is no casual version of this. There is no turning back." Xavier stepped closer, still holding the sheaf of poems. "I have been falling in love with you through terrible poetry for 6 months," he said. "I do not want a casual version. I do not want to turn back." Wren inhaled sharply. "You do not know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying," Xavier replied. "I want more terrible poems. I want to wake up and check the fence and find your clumsy rhymes waiting for me. I want to write replies and draw ridiculous hedgehogs and make you smile. I want to know what you think about when you work the forge. I want to hear your voice in my house. He stopped, searching for the right words. "I want you, if you will have me." For a heartbeat, Wren just stared at him. Then she closed the distance between them in 2 strides and kissed him, fierce and sudden and tasting of coal smoke and summer air. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Wren's face was flushed darker green, and her tusks showed when she smiled. "I will write you more poems," she said. "They will still be terrible." "Good," Xavier said and kissed her again. For 3 weeks, everything was perfect. Wren came to the farm in the evenings after the forge cooled, and they sat on the porch and talked until the stars came out. She still left poems on the fence. She said it was tradition, and traditions mattered, and Xavier still framed them and hung them on the walls. She had a sly sense of humor beneath her reserve, and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. She told him about her clan in the mountains, about growing up learning metalwork from her father, about the reason she had left. He told her about inheriting the farm, about the loneliness of working the land alone, about the day he found the first poem and how it had changed everything. They were careful in public, keeping their affection quiet. Millbrook was tolerant, but tolerance had limits. Still, people noticed. The baker saw them walking together by the river. The miller's wife saw Wren leaving the farm at dawn. Rumors began to spread, as rumors always did in small villages. Xavier did not care. He had never been happier. Then Gareth Stonefist arrived and everything went to hell. Gareth was an orc, broad and heavily muscled, with iron-gray skin and tusks that jutted like daggers. He was a metalworker from Wren's old clan, come south on business, and he arrived in Millbrook with 3 younger orcs in tow and a disapproving scowl carved into his face. He set up a temporary forge in the village square and began taking commissions, undercutting Wren's prices and making pointed comments about quality and tradition. Wren tensed the moment she heard he was in town. "Gareth is my father's oldest friend," she told Xavier quietly. They were in his kitchen, and she was staring at the poems on the wall as though they were evidence of a crime. "He is also the reason I left the clan. He wanted me to marry his son. I refused. He said I was choosing dishonor over duty." "You do not owe him anything," Xavier said. "He will make trouble," Wren replied. "He always does." She was right. Gareth came to her forge the next morning, and Xavier heard the shouting from his fields. By the time he reached the road, a small crowd had gathered, and Gareth was standing in the doorway of the forge with a piece of parchment in his hand, reading aloud in a mocking sing-song. "Your beard is like the hedgehog brown, it prickles when you wear your frown. This is orc courtship poetry," Gareth announced to the crowd, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you know what this means? It means Wren Aldrich has entered into a binding vow-craft with a human. She has shamed herself and dishonored her clan by giving her poetry to a man who is not even her own kind." Wren stood inside the forge, her face carved from stone, but Xavier could see the humiliation in the rigid line of her shoulders. "How did you get that?" she asked, and her voice was dangerously quiet. "You left it on a fence post like garbage," Gareth said. "Anyone could have found it. Anyone could have read it. You treat sacred tradition like a joke, and for what? For him?" He pointed at Xavier, who had pushed his way to the front of the crowd. "A human farmer who does not even understand what he holds in his hands." "That is enough," Xavier said. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Gareth laughed. "Oh, the human speaks. Tell me, farmer, do you know what it means when an orc writes courtship poetry? Do you know the weight of the vow she is making? Or do you think this is just a game, a bit of rustic fun before you move on to the next girl?" "I know exactly what it means," Xavier said. He walked forward until he was standing directly in front of Gareth, close enough to see the sneer in the older orc's eyes. "It means she has chosen me. It means I am the luckiest man in this village. It means those poems are worth more to me than anything else I own." "Then you are a fool," Gareth said, "and she is a disgrace." The crowd murmured, a low, uneasy sound. Xavier could see doubt on some faces, curiosity on others. The baker looked shocked. The miller's wife looked scandalized. The blacksmith's apprentice, a young human boy, looked fascinated. Wren stepped out of the forge and the crowd fell silent. She looked at Gareth, then at Xavier, then at the parchment in Gareth's hand. "Give that back," she said. "No," Gareth replied. "This is proof of your dishonor. I will take it back to the clan elders. They will see what you have become." "The clan exiled me," Wren said flatly. "They have no authority over me anymore." "You were not exiled," Gareth corrected. "You left. You ran away because you were too proud to accept the match your father arranged. And now you disgrace yourself further by loving someone who loves me back." Wren's voice cracked like a whip. "By choosing my own path instead of the one you wanted for me. Yes, Gareth, that is exactly what I am doing." "Then you are a fool," Gareth said again, and he tore the parchment in half. Wren flinched as though he had struck her. Xavier moved without thinking. He crossed the space between them and punched Gareth in the jaw, a solid right hook that sent the older orc staggering back into the forge's doorframe. The crowd gasped. Gareth recovered quickly, his face darkening with rage, and he lunged forward with one massive fist raised. But Wren stepped between them, catching Gareth's wrist in mid-swing. "Do not," she said, and her voice was cold enough to freeze blood. "You have insulted me. You have insulted him. You have torn my poetry like it was trash. You will leave now, or I will make you leave." Gareth stared at her, breathing hard. "You would choose him over your own people." "I would choose him over anyone," Wren said. "Including you." For a long, tense moment, Gareth did not move. Then he wrenched his wrist free, spat on the ground, and shoved his way through the crowd. His 3 companions followed, shooting dark looks over their shoulders. The crowd began to disperse, whispering among themselves. Xavier could already hear the shape of the gossip that would spread through the village. The orc blacksmith and the human farmer, a public confrontation, violence, torn poetry. It would be the talk of Millbrook for weeks. Wren bent down and picked up the torn pieces of parchment. Her hands were shaking. "I am sorry," Xavier said quietly. "Do not apologize," Wren replied. "You defended me." "That is more than—" She stopped, her voice breaking. Xavier took the torn pieces from her hands and held them carefully. "I will fix this," he said. "I promise." "You cannot fix this," Wren said. "The whole village knows now. They know about the poems. They know about us. Gareth will spread the story, and even if the clan has no authority over me, the gossip will. People will say I am a disgrace. They will say you are a fool. They will say we are breaking tradition and dishonoring both our peoples." "Let them say it," Xavier replied. "I do not care." "You should care," Wren said, and there were tears in her eyes. "I have brought you nothing but trouble. I should never have left those poems. I should never have let this happen." "Do not say that," Xavier said sharply. "Do not ever say that." But Wren shook her head and walked back into the forge, and when Xavier tried to follow, she closed the door in his face. That night, Xavier sat in his kitchen surrounded by framed terrible poetry and tried to think. The torn poem lay on the table in front of him, the two halves not quite matching up. Gareth had called Wren a disgrace. He had mocked her poetry, her choices, her love. He had tried to humiliate her in front of the entire village, and he had very nearly succeeded. Xavier had punched him, which had felt satisfying in the moment, but it had not solved anything. If anything, it had made things worse. Violence answered nothing. Gossip could not be silenced with fists. But maybe it could be answered with words. He looked up at the poems on the walls, 17 framed disasters that meant more to him than gold. Wren had written them in secret, too afraid to claim them openly. She had hidden her feelings because the world told her they were wrong, that a human and an orc could not love each other without shame. But Xavier was not ashamed. He was proud. Proud of her courage, proud of her terrible rhymes, proud that she had chosen him out of all the people in the world. He just needed everyone else to see it. The next morning, Xavier went into the village and spoke to the carpenter. He commissioned a large wooden board, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, smooth and sanded. Then he went to the general store and bought paint, brushes, and a small pot of varnish. He carried everything back to the farm and set to work. It took him 2 days. He painted the board a warm honey color, then carefully copied out every single poem Wren had ever written him, one after another in neat rows. He copied his replies too, and the little hedgehog sketches, and the notes she had added in the margins. When the board was covered in words from edge to edge, he varnished it to protect it from the weather, then built a sturdy frame to hold it upright. On the 3rd day, he loaded the board onto his wagon and drove it into the village square. A crowd gathered almost immediately. People stared, whispered, pointed. Xavier ignored them. He set up the board right in the center of the square, angled so that anyone walking past could read it, and he hammered the frame deep into the ground so it would not tip over. Then he stood in front of it and waited. It did not take long. The baker came over first, squinting at the words. The miller's wife followed, her lips pursed in disapproval. The blacksmith's apprentice came running, his eyes wide with excitement. Within an hour, half the village had gathered around the board, reading the poems aloud to each other, laughing at the clumsy rhymes, murmuring over the earnest sentiments. Gareth arrived, his face thunderous. "What is this?" "This," Xavier said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is courtship. This is a woman who saw something worth loving in a man who did not deserve it, and she tried to put that feeling into words. She is not a poet. She is a blacksmith, but she tried anyway because that is what love does. It makes us brave enough to be foolish." He turned to face the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. "Wren Aldrich wrote these poems for me. Every single one. They are terrible and they are beautiful, and I have framed them on my walls because they are the finest thing I have ever owned. If you think that is shameful, then you do not understand what it means to be loved." Gareth stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You make a mockery of Orc tradition." "I honor Orc tradition," Xavier shot back. "Wren told me that poetry is how her people declare intent. She wrote to me in secret, afraid of what people like you would say, afraid that you would call her a disgrace, afraid that I would reject her." He gestured at the board. "But I did not reject her. I fell in love with her. And I am declaring my intent right now in front of everyone so that there can be no doubt. These poems are courtship and I accept them. I accept her. If that breaks some rule or dishonors some clan, then the rules are wrong." The crowd was silent. Gareth looked around, saw the expressions on people's faces, and his jaw tightened. "You think this changes anything?" he demanded. "You think a public display will?" "I think it changes everything," Xavier interrupted, "because now everyone knows. They know that Wren loves me enough to write terrible poetry. They know that I love her enough to frame every page. They know that we chose each other freely without shame. And if you have a problem with that, Gareth Stonefist, then you can take it up with me." Gareth stared at him, breathing hard. Then, to Xavier's surprise, he laughed. It was a bitter, ugly sound. "You are a fool," he said, "and so is she. You will regret this, both of you." "No," said a voice from the edge of the crowd. "They will not." Everyone turned. Wren stood at the edge of the square, still wearing her leather apron, her face flushed and her eyes bright. She walked forward slowly, and the crowd parted to let her through. She stopped in front of the board and read the poems in silence. Her lips moved as she traced the familiar words, the terrible rhymes, the earnest declarations. When she reached the end, she turned to Xavier, and there were tears streaming down her green cheeks. "You did this," she whispered. "I did," Xavier said. "I meant what I said. I am not ashamed. I am proud." Wren looked at Gareth, then back at Xavier. Then she stepped forward and kissed him, right there in the middle of the village square in front of everyone. The crowd erupted. Some people cheered. Some people gasped. The blacksmith's apprentice whooped with delight. The baker started clapping and others joined in, tentative at first, then louder. Gareth made a disgusted noise and stalked away, his companions trailing behind him. Wren broke the kiss and rested her forehead against Xavier's. "You are a ridiculous man," she said, and her voice was shaking with laughter and tears. "I know," Xavier replied, "but I am your ridiculous man." "Yes," Wren said, "you are." That evening they sat on Xavier's porch and watched the sun set over the fields. The board was still standing in the village square. The mayor had decided to leave it up for a week, as a curiosity, though Xavier had a feeling it would stay longer than that, and the gossip had shifted from scandalous to romantic. People were already talking about the strange courtship between the orc blacksmith and the human farmer, the terrible poetry and the grand gesture. Xavier did not care what they said. He had Wren beside him, her hand in his, and that was enough. "Gareth is gone," Wren said quietly. "He left this afternoon, took his people and went back north." "Good," Xavier said. "He will tell the clan elders what happened," Wren continued. "They will have opinions." "Let them have opinions," Xavier replied. "We are here, they are there. What can they do?" Wren smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "I do not know, but I know that I do not regret this, any of it." "Neither do I," Xavier said. He squeezed her hand. "So what happens now?" Wren was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "In my clan, when a woman finishes her courtship poems, she writes one final piece. It is an invitation. If the man accepts, they are bound." "What kind of invitation?" Xavier asked. "A wedding invitation," Wren said softly. Xavier's heart kicked hard against his ribs. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Not yet," Wren said, and there was a teasing note in her voice. "I have to write the poem first, and it has to be good. That is the tradition. All the other poems can be terrible, but the last one must be perfect." "How will you manage that?" Xavier asked, grinning. Wren laughed and shoved his shoulder. "I will find a way, even if it kills me." She did find a way, but it took time. Autumn came and the harvest, and Xavier was busy from dawn until dusk bringing in the wheat and preparing the farm for winter. Wren helped when she could, taking time away from the forge to work beside him in the fields. They fell into an easy rhythm, the kind of partnership that felt like it had always existed. The village grew accustomed to seeing them together, and the scandal faded into acceptance. Wren was still the blacksmith, Xavier was still the farmer, and now they were also something more. The poems continued. Wren left them on the fence post as always, and they were as terrible as ever. Xavier framed them all and started hanging them in the bedroom when the kitchen ran out of space. "The frost came early to the fields today and made the pumpkin silver gray. You wore your heavy coat and scarf and made me smile. You made me laugh. It did not rhyme properly." The meter was a mess. Xavier loved it more than poetry that had won prizes. Winter arrived, sharp and cold. The forge was busy. Everyone needed tools repaired or replaced before the deep snows came, and Xavier spent his days mending fences and tending the animals. They saw each other less, but the poems kept coming, little notes of warmth in the frozen months. Then, in early spring, Xavier found a new poem on the fence post, and his breath caught in his throat. It was longer than the others, written on thick parchment with careful, deliberate handwriting. The rhymes were perfect. The meter was flawless. It was, by any measure, a genuinely good poem. "I have written you 17 terrible rhymes, and you have kept them all through changing times. I wrote of hedgehogs, turnips, and the moon of morning frost and harvest afternoons. Each clumsy line was truth I could not say, each mangled verse a piece of me I gave away. But now I write with clarity and care to ask you if the life I have is one you wish to share. Will you take my name, my forge, my love? Will you stand beside me as stars wheel above? Will you bind your life to mine in vow and deed? I am not perfect, but you are all I need if you accept. Then meet me where the poems began, at the fence post between your land and mine. I will be waiting, hoping you will understand that terrible or perfect, you are the reason I write every line. Xavier read it 3 times, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack a rib. Then he folded the poem carefully, tucked it into his pocket, and ran. Wren was waiting at the fence post, exactly as the poem had promised. She was wearing a green dress he had never seen before, simple but beautiful, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked nervous, her hands clasped in front of her, her river-stone eyes watching him approach. "You wrote a good poem," Xavier said when he reached her, slightly out of breath. "I had help," Wren admitted. "The baker's wife used to write poetry when she was young. I asked her to teach me." "You asked the baker's wife?" Xavier was delighted. "The one who looked scandalized in the square." "She was not scandalized," Wren said, smiling. "She was shocked. There is a difference. And she said that if I was going to marry a human, I should at least do it with proper poetry." "I see," Xavier said. He pulled the poem from his pocket and held it up. "So this is a wedding invitation." "It is," Wren said. Her voice was steady, but he could see the fear underneath. "If you want it to be." Xavier stepped forward and took her hands in his. "I want it to be," he said. "I have wanted it to be since the moment I found the first terrible poem on this fence. I love you, Wren Aldrich. I love your terrible poetry and your perfect poetry and everything in between. I love the way you laugh and the way you work metal, and the way you look at me like I am something worth writing about. I will marry you. I will stand beside you. I will frame every poem you ever write for the rest of our lives." Wren let out a shaky breath, and then she was laughing and crying at the same time, pulling him close and holding him tight. "You are still a ridiculous man," she said into his shoulder. "I know," Xavier replied, "but I am your ridiculous man." They were married in the village square, on the spot where Xavier had set up the board of poems. The mayor officiated, reading from a book of human ceremonies, but Wren added orc traditions too. The exchange of tools, the binding of hands with iron wire, the recitation of vows in both languages. The whole village came, even the people who had once whispered and disapproved. The baker made a cake. The miller brought wine. The blacksmith's apprentice stood up and gave a rambling, heartfelt speech about love and metalwork that made everyone laugh. Gareth did not come, but they had not expected him to. After the ceremony, Xavier and Wren walked back to the farm together, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon sun. The board of poems still stood in the square. The mayor had decided to make it permanent, a landmark, a testament to the strange courtship that had become village legend, but Xavier had brought the original framed poems home. They hung on every wall, a gallery of disaster and devotion. "Where should we hang the wedding invitation?" Xavier asked, looking around the crowded kitchen. "Somewhere special," Wren said. She walked to the far wall, the one above the table where they ate breakfast, and pointed. "Here, so we can see it every morning." Xavier hung the poem carefully, making sure it was straight. Then he stepped back and looked at the collection, all the terrible rhymes and the one perfect one, and he felt a swell of happiness so large it almost hurt. "Do you think you will write more poems?" he asked. Wren laughed. "I do not know. The courtship is over. The invitation has been accepted. Tradition does not require more." "But you could write them anyway," Xavier suggested. "If you wanted to." "Maybe," Wren said. She slipped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his chest. "But they will probably be terrible again. I only have one good poem in me." "That is fine," Xavier said, kissing the top of her head. "I prefer the terrible ones." They stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by framed poetry and golden afternoon light. Outside, the fields were turning green with new growth, and the forge down the road was quiet for the first time in months. The world felt wide and full of possibility. Wren pulled back slightly and looked up at Xavier, her eyes shining. "Do you remember what you said in the square?" "That love makes us brave enough to be foolish," "I remember," Xavier said. "I think it also makes us brave enough to be happy," Wren said softly. "Even when the world says we should not be." "Then we will be foolish and happy," Xavier replied, "for the rest of our lives," and they were. The years passed in the way that happy years do, swift and golden and full of small moments that added up to a life. Wren continued to run the forge, and her reputation grew. People came from neighboring villages to have their tools made by the orc blacksmith who had married the farmer, the one from the story about the terrible poetry. Xavier worked the farm, and the harvests were good. They built an addition onto the house, more rooms for the future they were planning. The poems did not stop. Wren kept writing them, tucking them into the fence post or leaving them on Xavier's pillow or pinned to the barn door. They were still terrible, full of broken rhymes and lurching meter, and Xavier still framed every single one. They covered the walls of the new addition, a spreading gallery of love that guests would stare at in fascination and amusement. 2 years after the wedding, Wren discovered she was pregnant. Xavier cried when she told him, and she cried too, and then they sat together on the porch and made plans for a cradle and baby clothes and all the things they would need. The village celebrated with them, throwing a party in the square beneath the board of poems that had started it all. Their daughter was born in early spring, small and squalling and perfect. She had Xavier's brown hair and Wren's green skin, and her tiny tusks were just beginning to show. They named her Rowan, after the tree that grew beside the forge, and she became the heart of their home. Wren wrote her a poem the day she was born. It was, predictably, terrible. "Your fingers are small like flower buds, your eyes are dark like evening clouds, you make noises loud and strong, welcome to the world, small one. You belong." Xavier framed it and hung it above the cradle. And Rowan grew up surrounded by her mother's terrible poetry and her father's sketches, and the knowledge that she was loved beyond measure. When Rowan was 3, Wren wrote another poem and left it on the fence post. Xavier found it in the morning, read it, and walked to the forge with a grin on his face. "Again?" he asked. "Again," Wren confirmed, her hand resting on her stomach. Their second daughter arrived in autumn, just as the leaves were turning gold. They named her Stella because she was born under a sky full of stars, and she had her mother's river stone eyes and her father's easy smile. Wren wrote her a poem too, just as terrible as Rowan's, and Xavier framed it beside her sister's. The house filled with laughter and chaos and love. Rowan learned to work metal at her mother's side, her small hands shaping iron under Wren's careful guidance. Stella loved the farm, following Xavier through the fields and learning the names of every plant and animal. They were different, the 2 girls, but they were fiercely loyal to each other and to their parents. The village embraced them. The story of the terrible poetry had become legend, the kind of tale people told when they wanted to believe in love that crossed boundaries. Children grew up hearing about the orc blacksmith and the human farmer who had defied tradition and chosen each other, and about the poems that had hung in the square for everyone to see. Gareth never returned. Word filtered south occasionally from the orc clans in the mountains, news of feuds and alliances, births and deaths, but Wren paid it little attention. Her life was here in Millbrook, with Xavier and their daughters and the forge and the farm and the terrible poetry that never stopped coming. One evening, when Rowan was 10 and Stella was 7, the family sat together on the porch watching the sunset. The fields were golden with late summer wheat, and the air smelled of earth and growing things. Rowan was sketching in a notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Stella was braiding grass stems into a crown. Xavier and Wren sat close together, their hands entwined, comfortable in the silence. "Papa," Rowan said suddenly, looking up from her notebook, "why did you keep Mama's poems when they were so bad?" Xavier and Wren exchanged a glance, and Xavier smiled. "Because they were honest," he said. "Your mother did not know how to write good poetry, but she tried anyway. She put her feelings into words even though she was afraid they would sound foolish. That kind of bravery is worth more than perfect rhymes." "But they were really bad," Rowan insisted. "I have read them, they do not even rhyme right." "No," Xavier agreed, "they do not, but they were hers. She wrote them for me and that made them precious." Stella looked up from her grass crown. "Mama, why did you write poems instead of just talking to Papa?" Wren considered the question. "Because I was afraid," she said finally. "I thought if I spoke to him directly, he would see me as just an orc, someone strange and different. But if I wrote poems, I could show him how I felt without being there to see his reaction. It was cowardly, maybe, but it was all I could manage." "It was not cowardly," Xavier said firmly. "It was brave, and it worked." Rowan frowned at her notebook. "I think I understand," she said slowly. "It is like when I make you things in the forge. I am not good at saying how I feel, so I make things instead." "Exactly," Wren said, and her voice was warm with pride. Stella finished her grass crown and set it on her head. "When I grow up, I am going to write poems too," she announced. "But mine will rhyme properly." Everyone laughed, and the moment passed into the easy rhythm of family conversation. But later, when the girls were asleep, Wren wrote a new poem and left it on Xavier's pillow. "Our daughters have your kindness, and your smile they have my strength. My stubborn will they ask me why I wrote you verse, and I tell them. Because he was worth every terrible rhyme, because love is not about perfection, it is about trying, failing, trying again, it is about seeing someone and thinking, yes, this one, this strange and wonderful one, I would write 1,000 awful poems if it meant I could see you smile." Xavier found the poem in the morning and framed it without hesitation. The walls were running out of space again, but he did not care. He would build another edition if he had to. The house would become a monument to terrible poetry, and that was exactly how it should be. Years continued to pass. Rowan grew into a skilled blacksmith, taking over more of the forge work as Wren's hands began to ache with age. Stella became the farm's manager, her organizational skills and plant knowledge making the harvests more efficient than ever. Both daughters found love in their own time, Rowan with a traveling merchant who appreciated her dry humor, Stella with a village teacher who shared her love of growing things, and the family expanded with grandchildren and new stories. Through it all, the poems continued. Wren wrote them less frequently as the years took their toll, her handwriting growing shakier, but she never stopped entirely. Each one was still terrible. Each one was still framed. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the village threw a celebration in the square. The board of poems had become a landmark, weathered but still standing, and someone had built a small shelter over it to protect it from the elements. Children used it as a meeting place. Lovers stood beneath it and read the words aloud to each other. It had become a symbol of the village itself, proof that love could cross any boundary if it was brave enough. Xavier and Wren stood together beneath the board, older and grayer but still holding hands the way they had on their wedding day. The mayor gave a speech about tradition and courage. The baker, now elderly herself, told the story of teaching Wren to write good poetry for the wedding invitation. Rowan and Stella presented their parents with a gift, a new frame, beautifully crafted, containing every poem Wren had written in the past 30 years, arranged in chronological order. "There are 147 poems in this frame," Rowan said, her voice thick with emotion. 147 terrible, beautiful declarations of love. We thought you should have them all in one place. Wren looked at the frame, at the familiar, terrible handwriting covering sheet after sheet of parchment, and tears streamed down her green cheeks. "I cannot believe you counted them," she whispered. "We counted them because they matter," Stella said. "Because you taught us that love is not about being perfect. It is about showing up again and again, even when you fail." Xavier pulled Wren close, and she buried her face in his shoulder the way she had so many times over the years. The crowd applauded, and someone started playing music, and the celebration went on into the night. But Xavier and Wren slipped away early, walking back to the farm hand in hand through the quiet evening. The fields were silver under the moon, and the air was cool and sweet. The house waited for them, every wall covered in framed poetry, every room full of memories. They sat on the porch, the same porch where they had sat so many times before, and watched the stars come out. "You remember the first poem you wrote?" Xavier asked. "I remember being terrified," Wren said. "I thought you would laugh at me, or worse, that you would ignore it." "I could never have ignored it," Xavier said. "It was the most wonderful, terrible thing I had ever read." Wren laughed, the sound soft and familiar. "I was so bad at poetry." "You still are," Xavier teased, and she elbowed him gently. "I know," she said, "but you keep framing them anyway." "I will keep framing them until the day I die," Xavier said, "and probably after if I can find a way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the farm, the rustle of wind through wheat, the distant call of an owl, the soft murmur of the river. "Xavier," Wren said finally, "thank you." "For what?" "For keeping the poems," she said. "For defending me in the square. For building a life with me even when it was hard. For making me believe that love could be enough." Xavier turned to look at her, this woman who had left terrible poems on his fence and changed his entire world. Her green skin was lined with age, her black braid was streaked with silver, but her river-stone eyes were the same as they had been the first time she stood on his porch and confessed that she had written the poems. "You do not have to thank me," he said. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done." Wren smiled, and it was the same smile she had given him 30 years ago when he kissed her in the village square. "I think I have one more poem in me," she said. "One last terrible poem." "You do not have to write more," Xavier said. "The courtship ended a long time ago." "I know," Wren said, "but I want to. Will you read it when I am done?" "Always," Xavier promised. That night, Wren sat at the kitchen table surrounded by 30 years of framed terrible poetry and wrote her final poem. It took her hours, the words coming slowly, but when she finished, she felt a deep sense of completion. She folded the parchment carefully and left it on Xavier's pillow, the way she had so many times before. In the morning, Xavier found it. He unfolded the parchment and read. The rhymes were forced, the meter was broken, and one line did not even make grammatical sense. It was also the most beautiful thing Xavier had ever read. He found Wren in the forge, working on a repair for one of the village farmers. She looked up when he entered, saw the poem in his hand, and set down her hammer. "Well?" she asked. Xavier crossed the forge and kissed her soft and deep, tasting of coal smoke and 30 years of love. When he pulled back, he was smiling through tears. "It is perfect," he said. "And I am going to frame it right next to the wedding invitation." Wren laughed, and it was the best sound in the world. They hung the poem that evening in the place of honor above the kitchen table. The house was a monument to terrible poetry now. Every wall covered, every room a testament to a love that had been brave enough to be foolish and foolish enough to be brave. And when visitors came to the farm, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, neighbors and travelers, people who had heard the legend and wanted to see the poems for themselves, Xavier and Wren would sit on the porch and tell the story. They told it simply and honestly, the way it had happened. An orc woman who wrote terrible poetry about a farmer, and the farmer who framed every single page. It was not a grand story in the end. It was not about battles or great deeds or world-changing events. It was just a story about two people who chose each other, again and again in small ways and large ways, through 30 years of terrible poetry and perfect love. And that, Xavier thought, was the best kind of story there was.